Dr. Wong, you are a professor of American Studies, Government and Politics, and a core faculty member in the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland, College Park. You are also a senior researcher at AAPI Data, a publisher of demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Thank you so much for being here today.
Great to be here.
Thanks. So I'd love to just jump into the topic. And, the US has seen an increase in anti-Asian violence amid the ongoing pandemic, and analysts have noted that hate crime data may be an insufficient tool for fully capturing the spike. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I think there's long been awareness in advocacy communities that hate crime data is limited, partly because of reporting. So our research, the research I do with Karthik Ramakrishnan, one of your faculty members who is the founder and director of AAPI Data, show that many Asian Americans, as well as other racial groups, people from other racial groups, don't feel confident in or are reluctant to report a hate crime to law enforcement in particular. So there are other kinds of ways that people report experiences with racial bias and also racialized violence. And so we have been doing some of that work through survey data. Again, that's not perfect either, but we get a slightly different picture because it doesn't just rely on people kind of getting motivated to advocate for themselves through an official channel, but this is a way to contact many people, some of whom have had those experiences, others who haven't, and then we get a better sense based on who answers our questions about who might have or might not have experienced a hate crime.
So my question for you, Dr. Wong, is the fatal shooting at 3 spas at the Atlanta area took 8 lives too soon. Six out of the individuals were women from Asian descent. Debate about whether the shooting was racially motivated continues to be highly politicized. What are your thoughts on this and the effects it has on the Asian community?
Yeah, so that shooting has now been the shooter has now been charged with a hate crime, and that charge not only includes uh, targeting the victims based on their national origin, but also on their gender. And so I think what that incident really raises up is the multiple ways in which people are vulnerable. And so we know that those victims were, of course, 6 of them were Asian American, but they were also vulnerable due to their economic position as frontline workers who were placed in this more precarious position because they were out there having to, uh, you know, make a living through a kind of risky, even in terms of health reasons, kind of risky interfacing with the public during the pandemic. And then also their gender made them a target. And so I think that discussion has been really uh, gotten deeper because of especially community organizations in Atlanta were very intentional about not only focusing on the victim's race, but also their gender and economic status and immigrant status.
Definitely. And following that unfortunate, unacceptable incident, President Biden announced additional actions to respond to anti-Asian violence, xenophobia, and bias. These actions build on the president's memorandum condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States, issued his first week in office. Are these executive actions symbolic or impactful, in your opinion?
I mean, that's a great question for those of you in the School of Public Policy. There is so much, I think, so much of a live conversation around that very question in the Asian American community. And to raise up some of the uh, kind of tensions in the community, there is this discussion over whether an executive action is symbolic or not, but also what kind of legislation makes sense. Does do hate crime laws prevent hate crimes? That's a question for those of you in public policy. There's a very important debate going on in terms of whether law enforcement should be involved at all, because maybe that doesn't get to the roots of the problem. So some say that, you know, many of the street crimes we've been seeing are not necessarily going to be countered by, let's say, increasing police presence. That's only going to especially hurt Black and Brown communities that have been oppressed and targeted by police violence, but instead maybe a kind of deeper investment in community health, that is more social services, more mental health services, more anti-poverty programs to really try to confront racial segregation. Those kinds of programs might be more meaningful to and effective in terms of um, really getting to the roots of the kind of violence we're seeing, not just in Asian American communities. So, you know, I've now seen quite a bit of data from different sources that shows that not only are Asian Americans experiencing an uptick in violence since the start of the pandemic, but Black communities are experiencing the same levels of hate crimes and racialized violence, and then also Native American communities. And then, of course, we know that um, especially Latinx communities have been very hard hit by xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. And so, you know, how should we, as uh, those who are interested in effective public policies, really get to the roots of some of these expressions and consequences of racialized hate in the U.S. And I'm not sure there's really a clear answer yet, whether it's whether the answer is through um, executive action and focus on law enforcement, or whether you know, we should really be turning to more systemic and long-term solutions.
I love that. And I would love to ask a follow up if that's okay. I agree. I do think systemic change is necessary for so many groups in America. I'm curious at the local level, if you have any advice for you know, local change makers or just a neighbor, a friend. What can we do to help the AAPI community?
Yeah, so this has also been important around the country. We've seen many presentations and efforts to engage local communities in this broader discussion of discrimination and bias against Asian Americans, but also, you know, kind of in the wake of the George Floyd murder, there's a lot of attention to just racial, systemic racial inequality more generally. And specific to the Asian American community, you know, I think that there are especially students who are starting to get very active, and I'm sure this is the case in Riverside too, around ethnic studies programs and trying to institute more coursework and substantive content on not only Asian American history, Asian American political engagement, but also in the kinds of discrimination that Asian American communities have faced, but also to introduce that content in relation to other kinds of ethnic studies topics, and to help people in general, but especially students, to understand this kind of um, diverse racial landscape that we are all immersed in. So that's one thing that I've seen at the local level. In addition, having more resources provided to especially targeted outreach programs that are in language, both in terms of Asian languages and in Spanish and African languages. And so that kind of deeper communication between government entities and local communities, I think, is critically important as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Building trust at the local level can really help the community strengthen and politically motivate the community to also push for legislation in their favor to decrease anti-hate crimes. So my next question is about representation at the federal level. 15% of all appointees identified as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in President Biden's administration. Do you believe representation at the federal level will help shine a light on the needs of the AAPI community? And is it enough?
Yeah, I think that again, this has been a hot topic in Asian American communities about at what level is that representation robust. For instance, there's been a lot of complaints and that there hasn't been an Asian American member of the cabinet, even though there are quite a few appointees in the administration. And from my perspective, I think that it is critically important to uh, have representation at different levels of elected office and appointed office in our government of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as well. But I think that that can only go so far. What really matters is the substantive policies that are generated. And I think there is some good evidence that having more diverse representation in elected offices and in government agencies and in different kinds of local positions does make a difference in terms of the substance of those policies. But of course, those of you in public policy do know very well that when the rubber hits the road, it is really about the kinds of policies that are generated and whether they are forwarding the interests of the community. I think it's not an either or. That of course, we see that the two often go hand in hand. That descriptive representation can and often does lead to substantive representation.
Yes, that's a really wonderful way to put it. Thank you for sharing that. The United States recently passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act by an overwhelming majority. I'm curious if you were surprised by this and if you are optimistic that the country will see further bipartisan support of the AAPI community.
I have mixed feelings about that legislation, partly because, I think that in many cases we have seen that there's been a reluctance to pass hate crime legislation or to recognize hate incidents, especially against other communities like Muslim Americans in the wake of 9/11, for instance. But at the same time, I think so I feel very mixed about it. I think that it could be effective. It's certainly not, hate crime legislation alone is not going to solve our problems. And so I hate to see so much energy going into passing that legislation when, I think it may be one part of a solution, but it's certainly not enough. And so I would like to, see I think, a broader agenda with regard to racial justice more generally, including for the Asian American community. And I do think that the focus on hate crimes really is one of more interpersonal violence, but doesn't get at other kinds of deep inequalities in our community that were exemplified by the Atlanta shooting. So, inequalities having to do with occupational status, economic status, gender, that kind of deep, persistent, these kinds of deep, persistent inequalities are not going to be addressed by hate crime legislation. So while I'm not personally opposed to that legislation, as long as it does not lead to, um, you know, more police enforcement, I guess, then uh, I just think that we need to do more and better on that front.
So leading up to that, so what, if any, policies do you believe should be enacted to further help the AAPI American citizens?
Yeah, so I think there's, a way of thinking more broadly, as I've mentioned, about the kind of policies that could help Asian Americans, and those have to do with relation to enhance ethnic studies um, in our public education system. Again, not just for Asian Americans, but more deeply across different groups. And also, I think, community liaisons being um, institutionalized in local government that can provide a hub for immigrant communities, Asian American communities, and other communities of color. So community liaisons who have cultural kind of awareness and who are sensitive to the needs of particular minoritized communities. And, thinking our immigration policies to ensure that deportations are that we take a close look at our deportation policies and to really protect those who are in the U.S. who shouldn't be deported. So that that's part of a larger discussion about these kinds of other kinds of anti-Asian violence that are taking place outside of the hate crimes context.
That's so important. I love that you're talking about hate crimes is one issue, but it doesn't represent all of the issues that are going on.
I think it's also critical to know that, hate crimes are, that most of the research is showing that maybe up to, in the last year, that's 2021, the first months of 2021, about our data show about 10%, other data show about 17% of Asian Americans have experienced anti-Asian discrimination. Most of that is not violence. It is, only a small, like 10% of that proportion is actual physical violence. And so we're talking about a very, in some ways, very small part of the problem, yet, the kind of poverty, educational access, that those barriers are much more widespread across our community, across other communities. And so putting all of our energy into solving the problem of racialized violence is still leaving a lot of other kinds of discrimination unaddressed. And I think that's something we want to take away from this moment.
Definitely. Well, Dr. Wong, you said you were so well spoken, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and opinions. And I learned so much. And I just hope, unfortunately, this pandemic and the traces to Wuhan, China have hurt the Asian American community. And I hope that out of this really awful situation, we can hopefully see that we need to help the entire community and focus on that discrimination and bias that so many experience every day. So thank you for speaking out on this topic, and I hope our listeners and those watching will take a lot away from this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Maddie and Jenny. Have a great day.